Five European nations, Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, and the United Kingdom, made a coordinated decision to seal their skies against American military aircraft. Not quietly, not apologetically, publicly, and in some cases, defiantly. What is being reported as a diplomatic disagreement is something categorically different. When sovereign nations inside a mutual defense alliance physically bar their treaty partner from using airspace during an active military operation, the alliance has already ended. The paperwork just hasn't caught up yet. Spain moved first. Defense Minister Margarita Robles made the declaration with the kind of finality that leaves no room for follow-up calls or damage control summits. American aircraft connected to operations against Iran were denied access to Spanish territory and to the strategic installations that Washington had operated from for decades, installations that, until that morning, had been treated as permanent fixtures of transatlantic military cooperation. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez went further, attaching a political verdict to the decision: reckless, illegal, unjust. Those three words were not chosen carelessly. They were a public judgment on American military policy delivered by a sitting NATO head of government. The sequence that followed moved with a speed that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. France suspended military supply movements. Italy closed Sigonella, one of the most strategically positioned bases in the Mediterranean, the moment it became clear what the incoming cargo was intended for. Portugal shut its Atlantic corridor, removing a routing option that American planners had relied on as a near-permanent geographic advantage. The cumulative effect on Pentagon logistics was immediate and severe. B-1B bombers that would normally fly direct corridors were rerouted over open ocean, extending missions by thousands of miles, burning fuel reserves, and introducing mechanical stress that planners do not budget for during combat operations. The most powerful air force on Earth was being forced to take the long way around because its closest allies had locked the front gate. The response from Washington did not come through formal diplomatic channels. It came the way this administration communicates when it wants to make sure there is no ambiguity in translation. A single word on social media: cowards. That word was not a slip. It was a declaration. It compressed an entire strategic assessment into one syllable and broadcast it to every defense ministry, every NATO planning cell, and every rival power watching the situation develop. What followed expanded on the accusation with a directness that the State Department had spent years carefully avoiding. The Strait of Hormuz carries European oil, European gas, and by extension, European economic survival. Washington had asked for ships. It had asked for aircraft. It had asked, in the most basic terms, for the alliance to function as an alliance. The answer it received was a series of closed doors. This is the point where the conversation shifted from political posturing to structural consequence. Article 5, the collective defense clause that had been the load-bearing pillar of NATO since 1949, was placed openly in question. Not through a formal withdrawal process, not through months of negotiation, through a statement that reframed the entire logic of the alliance in one sentence: if you will not stand with us, we will not stand for you. The implication was as clear as it was unprecedented. The guarantee that had made European security planning possible since the end of the Second World War was now conditional. And conditions, once introduced, do not disappear when the immediate crisis passes. The British dimension of this rupture carried a particular weight. No relationship in the transatlantic architecture had been treated as more durable, more personal, more foundational than the one between Washington and London. It had survived arguments over Suez, disagreements over Iraq, and decades of policy divergence. It had been called special so many times that the word had stopped meaning anything specific and started meaning everything implied. Keir Starmer ended that implication, standing before cameras with the composed delivery of someone who had rehearsed the moment many times. He delivered the sentence that will define his foreign policy legacy, regardless of everything else his government does. Britain is not your soldier. 4 words, The relationship that Churchill and Roosevelt built did not survive them. Washington's response to London made clear that there would be no private repair process, no quiet back-channel reconciliation of the kind that had smoothed over every previous Anglo-American friction. The message was public, blunt, and final. Manage your own energy supply. Build your own security architecture. The support structure that Britain had operated inside for 80 years was being withdrawn not gradually, but immediately. And the withdrawal was being announced in terms designed to be heard in every other capital simultaneously. The signal that most alarmed European leadership, however, did not come from the president. It came from Marco Rubio. For years, Rubio had served as the institutional anchor inside an administration that often pulled against institutions. When European diplomats needed reassurance that the alliance still meant something in Washington, Rubio was the voice they called. He was the proof that American foreign policy had not entirely abandoned its post-war commitments. That function is now gone. In a single interview, Rubio described the alliance using language that NATO's most vocal critics had spent years trying to mainstream and failing. A scam. A structure in which one party bears the cost of mutual defense, while the other party declines to reciprocate even the most basic operational requests. When that argument comes from the man who was supposed to be the bridge between America First instincts and alliance continuity, the bridge is not weakened. It is gone. On the ground, the operational consequences were already visible before the political statements finished circulating. The closure of the Atlantic corridor by Spain, Portugal, and France transformed the Mediterranean into a zone where American military logistics were no longer reliable. A specific incident in mid-March crystallized what this meant in practice. A B-1B Lancer returning from operations was refused entry to French, Spanish, and Portuguese airspace in sequence, 3 consecutive denials from treaty partners, forcing a combat aircraft of the world's dominant military power to reroute across open water with fuel margins that no operational planner would have signed off on in advance. That aircraft made it back. The alliance, in any meaningful operational sense, did not. What followed from Washington was not a heated reaction. It was a structured policy declaration. Energy independence was reframed as a European responsibility. If the sea lanes that carry Middle Eastern oil to European refineries require military protection, Europe can provide that protection. The American Navy had other priorities, closer to American shores. Missile defense, long subsidized by American taxpayers as part of the broader security umbrella, was recast as a commercial service that European governments could fund independently if they chose to prioritize it. The Iranian conflict was designated a loyalty test, and the results of that test were now permanently on the record. Nations that had declined to participate were moved to a different category of relationship, not enemy, but no longer ally in any operationally meaningful sense. Inside NATO headquarters, the weeks that followed the initial rupture produced something that had never quite been seen before in that building: the absence of a shared premise. Alliance planning has always required disagreement to be managed and competing interests to be reconciled, but it has always operated on a foundation of agreed purpose. That foundation was no longer present. Meetings produced language. Language produced statements. Statements produced nothing that resembled a coordinated position, because the core question, what NATO is for and who it is for, no longer had a common answer. European defense ministries began doing something that would have been politically impossible 18 months earlier, openly planning for a security environment without guaranteed American participation. Not as a theoretical exercise, as an operational requirement. Budget allocations shifted. Procurement timelines were compressed. Command structures that had been built around interoperability with American forces were redesigned around the possibility that American forces would not be present. The phrase strategic autonomy moved from the aspirational vocabulary of French foreign policy into the emergency planning documents of governments that had previously resisted the concept entirely. Eastern Europe absorbed the shift differently. For Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the American military presence was not a strategic preference. It was the entire basis of national security planning. The distance between these countries and Russian territory left no margin for the kind of gradual adjustment that Western European capitals were attempting. Emergency consultation processes were initiated. Readiness levels were elevated. The calculation being made in Warsaw and Tallinn was not whether the alliance had changed. It was how quickly an independent deterrence posture could be constructed and whether the timeline was realistic given the current threat environment. Markets processed all of this with the cold arithmetic that financial systems apply to geopolitical uncertainty. Defense sector valuations moved sharply. European energy prices, already elevated by months of supply disruption, spiked again as traders recalculated the risk premium attached to Middle Eastern supply routes no longer under American naval protection. The euro came under pressure. Investors who had treated European sovereign debt as a stable asset class were repricing that stability against a security landscape that had fundamentally changed. The economic cost of the alliance fracture was not a future risk. It was arriving in real time. Meanwhile, across the geopolitical landscape, governments outside the transatlantic system were watching and recalculating. In Asia, in the Middle East, and in capitals that had spent decades building their security assumptions around American permanence, quiet reassessments were underway. If the oldest and most institutionalized American alliance could fracture this completely this quickly, the reliability of every other American commitment required re-examination. Diplomatic outreach intensified between countries that had previously operated in separate orbits. The architecture of the international system was not just shifting. It was being rebuilt from different foundations. What emerges from all of this is not a temporary crisis moving toward resolution. It is a permanent reconfiguration of how power is organized in the Western world. Europe now faces a version of the question it successfully deferred for decades. Can it provide for its own security? And if so, at what cost, under what political conditions, and with what degree of internal cohesion? None of those questions have clean answers. Building a credible, independent defense capability requires funding at a scale that will reshape domestic political priorities across the continent. It requires trust between member states that have spent years accumulating grievances. And it requires a shared threat assessment that Europe's internal divisions have consistently made difficult to maintain. The United States, for its part, is not retreating from global engagement out of weakness. The calculation being made in Washington is strategic and deliberate, that the current form of alliance management is producing asymmetric costs, that European governments capable of shouldering more responsibility have chosen not to, and that the moment for that choice to carry consequences has arrived. Whether that calculation produces a more balanced transatlantic relationship over time or accelerates fragmentation is a question that will be answered by decisions not yet made. What is certain is that the world that existed before this week cannot be restored by a summit communique or a carefully worded joint statement or a phone call between heads of state. The assumptions have been revised. The dependencies have been exposed. The guarantees have been made conditional. And conditional guarantees are not guarantees. They are options. Options that one party holds and the other party must now plan around. That is not the beginning of a negotiation. It is the end of an era. Europe is standing in territory it has not occupied since 1945, responsible for its own security, uncertain of its own cohesion, and confronting a future that its current institutions were not designed to manage alone. The challenge is not only military, it is political, economic, and psychological. An entire generation of European leadership built its strategic worldview on the assumption that America would always be there. That assumption is no longer operational. What Europe builds next will define the continent for a generation. The question is whether it has the political will, the internal trust, and the shared sense of purpose to build anything at all. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because what comes next will not wait for anyone to catch up.